you. My name is Chris Broadwell. I'm the Executive Director of the English Speaking Union. And this building you're sitting in is both the home of the New York branch of the English Speaking Union and the national headquarters. We're a national organization. We have some 68 branches around the country that do all kinds of programs to support the use of English to broaden communication and break down cultural barriers. That's our general mission. So we're delighted to have you here today. This event is a mixture of national and New York, and that's fine. We love New York. And we're delighted to have you all here. I'm going to say no more. You can please find out more about the English Speaking Union. No doubt, if you're engaged in debate with Carol Lossos, our education director, you already have some understanding of what we're doing because you're doing it. So I welcome you. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Beresford-Hill, who is the president of the New York branch at the ESU. Here.
Well, firstly, I'd like to extend also my welcome to everybody who's here today, particularly the members and patrons of the ESU New York branch, as well as those from other branches who may be here today. I understand that Stephen Weber and Lorraine Prout, who are recent branch scholars, are here. If they are, I'd like to, if you'd like to stand up, please. And congratulations to the University Summer School. We have a group from the Mountbatten Institute, one of whom is a volunteer working with us. So can the Mountbattens just stand for a moment? And we're very, very happy today to have a group of middle school students from a number of schools that participate in our middle school debate program. And they are very special to us because they are the future of not only the English Speaking Union, but of lots of other wonderful things that they're going to contribute to the world as they move through life. So I'd like those young people to please stand up and receive acknowledgement from all of us. Thank you. I'd like to now extend a hearty welcome to the British debate team who have come with us from the UK, Chelsea Whalen and Matthew Wilmore. Okay, would you both please identify their they are from the English Speaking Union of the Commonwealth, which is our sister organisation based in London. And this is the oldest and arguably the most prestigious university debating tour. Is the annual between the US and the UK, sponsored by the English Speaking Union. We've been doing this since 1922. And each year the ESU of the Commonwealth sends 2 students, 2 debaters between September and November. And the tour is primarily an opportunity for these British debaters to practice their craft, as they will be doing tonight. And the list of alumni who have participated in this event in previous years includes a former British Prime Minister, a leader of the opposition, an Archbishop of Canterbury, and many senior politicians, journalists, and business people. So you are following very, very big shoes, and we expect you to rise to the occasion. Chess has just finished her 3-year BA in History at Balliol College, Oxford. And Matthew has completed an LLM in Human Rights at the University of Edinburgh. So again, we'd like to welcome you both here to New York and to the English Speaking Union. Finally, I'd like to welcome Stephen Lano, Dr. Stephen Lano from St. John's University, who will be the moderator here this evening, and also to welcome our debating teams from St. John's University and Adelphi University. And if you could identify yourselves, please, we'd like to give you a round of applause. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Lano.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Carol from the ESU for inviting us to participate in this event. Thanks for all of you for coming. I know that there's another event happening tonight involving a guy from Italy, I think, that you might want to meet instead, but this is a nice overflow crowd. I think it's very nice to come here and see this. But no, welcome to this. We at St. John's have been doing British parliamentary debate for about 8 years. That's as long as I've been there. And in 1920 or 1918, somewhere around what Paul was mentioning, is when A. Craig Baird, the professor of rhetoric at Bates College in Maine, went to Oxford and watched British debate and returned to write a paper in which he claimed that British debating was unfit for American audiences because there wasn't enough excitement, there wasn't enough energy, there wasn't enough, American audiences like blood, I guess. I mean, it wasn't like a sporting event. It was too polite and everyone was like giving these nice orations. Well, it's 2015 and things have changed. The national tournament held last year in Anchorage, Alaska, drew almost 200 teams from well over 40 different universities that were all American except for one from Saskatchewan. I guess it was a close drive for them to Anchorage. Canadian team came, that's nice. And it's a very different event now, but tonight you're going to get to see it. And we have a wonderful group of debaters. I'll introduce the St. John's debaters. And this is Professor Matthew Lavery here from Adelphi. And I'd like to ask him to introduce his debaters too. But first, I guess I should give you maybe a little overview of what's going to happen. There's a motion on the floor, it's on the handout, that the EU should take a minimum quota of refugees. Each EU state should take a minimum quota of refugees. There will be two teams, probably sitting on this side. I have to think of it from the perspective of the judge. Probably sitting over here who will be in favor of the motion, and two teams that will be opposed. These are two teams of two speakers, and each one is sort of vying for your attention, vying to say they made the best and most interesting arguments, either in favor of the motion or against it. So your charge as audience members is to think which team did the best job from their position with what was said on either supporting or denying the motion. Each speaker will go into it sort of like verbal tennis. Each one will sort of bat an argument this way, and then the other speaker will get up and they'll just go in order through the four speakers. And they're all sort of independent units. So I will introduce the debaters from St. John's and what position they'll be. There are four positions: opening proposition, opening opposition, closing proposition, and closing opposition. And each position has two speakers. So on the opening proposition, we have Caitlin Shea, who is, where are you? Yep, here she is. Caitlin is from Maryland, is a senior. She's getting the BA/MA program for experimental psychology at St. John's with minors in sociology and philosophy. And she has debated for 1 year and last year competed in the nationals in Alaska. So welcome, Caitlin. Her partner this evening is Zach Allen. Where is Zach? Zach is from San Francisco. He's a senior in the business management program at St. John's with a minor in Asian studies. And this is his third year of British parliamentary debating. Michaela Torres. There she is. Michaela is originally from Los Angeles, and she is a sophomore at St. John's University, double majoring in rhetoric and political science, and this is her second year in debating. And Hujan Goborn, right there, will be debating with Michaela. They'll be the closing opposition, and Caitlin and Zach will be the opening government this evening. And Hujan is from the Bronx, and he is an English major, and a sophomore at St. John's in his second year in debate. So those are the St. John's debaters. Do you want to introduce the Adelphi team?
Hi, everyone. Thanks to Dr. Yano for the introduction. Our debaters this evening will be two seniors at Adelphi University, John Sklar. They will be in opening opposition. John Sklar is a senior pre-law political science major. Gia Giambalo is a senior art history major at the university.
Thanks, Professor Lavery. This kind of debate is a little bit different than kind of the debates you might have seen on television, thankfully so. This debate involves a agreed-upon topic that they will be proposing and opposing, and it also involves a bit of audience interaction. So one of the things you have to get used to, and it might be easier for the junior high students here tonight to get used to that, is that if you hear an argument you like, it is appropriate to knock on something wooden, not your friend's head, but something like the back of the chair in front of you, perhaps. You can rap on it like this. Or if you don't have anything to knock on, you can clap for an argument that you like. Or if you really like it, you can say something like, here, here, if you think that that's a really important argument. They're already thank you. That's great. If I'm giving here, here's for the instructions for here, here, I'm an excellent speaker. And the other thing that'll happen, no drum solos, it's not here. But,
people sing parliamentary debates, like...
yeah, sometimes they will. Sometimes they will. But you don't want to, if you're supporting that person, you might not want to drown them out. It's like they're making the best arguments. I'm like, what? I didn't hear. They lose. But the other thing is that during the debate, you're going to see points of information. So the speeches are 5 minutes in length tonight. The middle 3 minutes will be available for points of information. So there'll be someone keeping time, probably me, in the back. And I will clap like this after the first minute, before the last minute, and then that means their time is expired. They need to yield the floor and sit down. After that first clap, it indicates to all the speakers on the other side of the house that they can rise on a point of information. So here's Andrea, St. John's debater. I'm going to have her demonstrate what it looks like to rise to a point of information. I'm talking, I'm giving my argument, and it's in the time. Now, she wants to ask me a question, or make an argument, or make a comment about what I'm saying. But I'm the speaker. I control the floor. I don't have to take her. No thanks. I can keep making my argument just like that. But she is insistent on getting her point in. So after about 20 seconds of the show, she can stand up again. I don't even have to acknowledge her. I can keep talking to you and just indicate to her that it's time to sit down. But if she stands up a third time, and I'm in between points, I might say, but you might have something to add to the debate. Go ahead. And then she will say something about it.
Dogs.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. She'll add about a 15 to 20 second thing. The rule for POIs is, I know it's almost Halloween time, but I want to bring your attention to another kind of candy in the world, the conversation heart. Before Valentine's Day, those little hearts that come out that are like almost pure sugar. They have little messages on them. A good POI is like a conversation heart. It's small, it's to the point, be mine, forever, right? It's to the point, and it's sweet. It's got a little zing to it, right? Former President George W. Bush said, you sure can't win debates, but the best thing to do in a debate is have a bunch of zingers. And the journalist said, President Bush, I don't understand what a zinger is. He's like, zingers, zingers. I don't know. But anyway, without any further ado from me, I think we should get this debate underway. I'd like to invite all the speakers to come up and take their positions at the table and get set up. And then we will begin the debate momentarily once they're all ready to go. So thank you all for coming very much. Thanks so much. And then at the end of the debate, we'll take questions and comments from the audience. Thanks. Alright, so we're going to run this debate just like they would in a British parliamentary competitive round, and I will serve as the chair of the debate. Most debates are judged by 3 judges, who then will confer at the end and offer a decision where they rank the debaters 1 through 4. Right? You're first, you're second, you're third, you're fourth. So we're not looking for a side victory here, which is very different for American audiences. Usually American audiences think it's yes or no, like a zero-sum game. BP debate is not a zero-sum game, like most political debates in our country. You have a 2-party system. Either win or you lose. But over there you have things like minority governments, coalition governments, things like that in parliamentary governments. So this mirrors that as a different sort of game. So it's first, second, third, fourth. So no first past the post, I'm sorry. So if you make a good argument, you haven't automatically won. Sorry. But anyway, we'll get it started with me chairing the debate. So I'd like to call the House to order and welcome everyone to tonight's debate. And I would like to recognize the Prime Minister to open up debate in this motion with a speech not to exceed 5 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
It's really cool. All right. Since 2011, approximately 9 million Syrians have fled their homes. Many are internally displaced, and even more so are looking for safety elsewhere. These are not migrant workers in search of better prospects. These are people who are at risk of death because of the civil war happening within their own borders. They recognize that other countries may not be welcoming, that they might face xenophobic attacks and racism within the places that they're going, but they think ultimately the reason that they're taking these voyages in vessels that are unworthy of sea travel and incredibly dangerous is because the chance of life, the chance of survival, surpasses that of death. That they think anything is better than the alternative of staying within their country. Now, how does the EU play a role into this, and what obligation do they have to these people? Before any economic incentives that it offers, it's founded on a few basic core principles, and that's the protection of human rights, dignity, liberty, and non-discrimination. These are the same very states that during the Geneva Convention agreed that human rights transcend those of the state. But there's a sad truth that we recognize on government side, and that truth is despite agreeing to this, not all nations are willing to take these people in. And are not willing to agree upon the terms that they originally vowed so long ago. Look, these refugees, there's no way in today's world for you to have an identity without a nation state. They're in danger in Syria, and it's too great to stay. These are people who are in limbo and there's a need for immediacy that cannot wait. We simply cannot wait for states to maybe take in these people. Their life's at stake, and there is a pressing urge that they need to take these people in. So what do we think they should do? We think that they should swear to uphold the principles that they initially swore to. Based on capacity, capabilities, and GDP, they should be able to take in a minimum number of refugees in order to help preserve life. And why? Because it keeps refugees safe and it maintains the principles they originally vowed for. So I'd like to go into a few things about why this is so necessary and why necessarily this is something that they should be doing. So what happens when you don't do this? You have overflowing. You have people going to places either based on proximity or economic gain. So you're having huge floods into Germany up until they close their borders. You're having them go into places that are very close, and they're simply overwhelming the states there. It's creating refugee ghettos where they're in extreme economic depravity, but you disagree.
Yeah, just a point of clarification. How are you going to distinguish between economic migrants and migrants fleeing from war-torn places like Syria?
You can look at paperwork that they're carrying paperwork that they're carrying, and also I think principally it's just something that we should be accepting. We think that these people are in such a state of depravity that this war is eroding human dignity, and it's a necessary right of the people within the EU to take this in. And let's be clear, these are not people simply trying to go to Greece. These are people trying to go to the EU. They're trying to go in a place with economic stability, but more important, safety. And we think the best way to do this is in order to spread the burden throughout the nation so you don't risk instability. Because what happens when you have instability? You're not necessarily putting them into places that are safer. We're trying to get the safest outcome for these people and maintain the very things that these countries swore to uphold. So, when you have people at risk of death, when you have people whose basic human dignity is gone, what then should we do? You do the best thing possible at protecting and safeguarding the very things that you swore to uphold. And the way that you do that is by sharing the burden. You take on what you can manage instead of leaving it to only a few states. What happens when you let Germany take on the burden by themselves? They become overwhelmed. They eventually shut down their burdens, and later on in the future, they can use that to bully other member states in the EU. What happens then is they say, look, remember that time when we had all those refugees and we took them in? You guys owe us. And that's bad for the future, not just of the refugees, but of the states within it. It doesn't do anything for security for either party. What we think we're doing is proposing a model that protects everyone in the best interest of not only the states involved, but the refugees. This is the best way to actually maintain human dignity and maintain the principles that this was founded on. What opposition needs to do is tell you why, even at risk of death, that what they stand for is better. The burden they need to prove is why anything, whether it's economic stability or anything like that, surpasses the need for safety. That anything they say, they have to necessarily say, is worth people dying. And we simply think that's a burden they can never meet. And on our side, we stand for human dignity, we stand for life. They have to tell you at what dollar amount, what potential risk these people are simply not worth saving. Is it $10, $100? We simply don't know because there's an inherent value to life. And if they say anything else, they need to tell you why that inherent value is gone and why these people do not deserve help. And on our side of the house, we are so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to welcome to the floor the Leader of the Opposition to open up his case with a 5-minute speech. Here, here.
Thank you, guys. I'm very excited to be here with you talking about the EU and debating about the EU. Unfortunately, if this motion gets implemented, we may no longer have the ability to debate about the EU, because the very existence of the EU is in question because of the implementation of this quota. So a couple points of rebuttal to begin. Protection of human rights. Our burden, they say our burden is to prove that something is more important than human rights. We don't think that's our burden at all. We agree, they want to take the righteous approach. We agree that saving those lives is very important. One, we don't think that this is the way about doing it. And two, we think we do have to consider the possible disintegration of the EU. So three of our points that we're going to bring to you. Our case is going to be the disintegration of the EU, why this will necessarily lead to that. Two, how we're creating something called the permanent immigrant, how these migrants are never going to feel, they're never going to have the identity of the nation state that they want, because they're never going to be welcome. And three, this is not the EU's sole responsibility, or maybe not even their responsibility at all. So, some rebuttal. First, they say that Germany, if they take more migrants than others, they're going to be able to use that as a bargaining chip. Okay, well, in this model, you have the UK, who has the ability to opt out of anything like this, but are choosing to, or potentially would choose to go along with it. They can also use that as a bargaining chip in the future, saying, hey, we agreed with you on that whole migrant thing, now we don't have to on something else because we already did that. So bargaining chips are not mutually exclusive to either side. We think it can happen on both sides. It's even more powerful on our side. One moment. And the whole, again, the identity of a nation state, we don't think they're ever going to have an identity if this is forced upon them. You disagree?
When Germany has oil that is harvesting oil in Syria and leading to the instability that's causing bodies to wash up on shore, do they have any sort of obligation to help fix the problem that they've caused?
I think everyone has some obligation. When you're looking at the hierarchy of obligation, Germany is not number one. US, Russia, Iran, to name a few, are on top of that list. And if they're not willing to create more of a responsibility for themselves, then the EU definitely is not obligated to and is not necessitated to. Okay, so one, the disintegration of the EU. The EU runs on a sovereignty type thing. So the EU has competence in some areas where they're allowed to boss the member states around and tell them what they have to do. But in other areas, it's very important that the member states keep their sovereignty. And some of them are only in the Union, like the UK, like the Czech Republic, because they have that type of sovereignty. The second you endanger that sovereignty is the second they start talking about getting out of the EU. The UK is having a referendum in a year or so to determine that. So the rise of anti-EU parties across Europe is very large. Imposing something like this that really imposes and infringes on their sovereignty is only going to increase, one, the ability of these political parties to increase their rhetoric about how bad the EU is and how bad they want to take away the lives of ordinary Europeans, and it's also going to create more political parties, and you're going to have the extreme right really rise up even more. No, thank you. Okay, second point. My partner's going to go deeper into all of this. Is the idea of the permanent immigrant. We think when the rhetoric coming out of Viktor Orban from Hungary, where he's saying that they're a threat to Christian identity, we don't want them in here, the rhetoric is extremely hot. We think this rhetoric is not uncommon, it's not unique to Hungary, it's happening all over Europe. And if the citizens don't already feel this, eventually there's going to be a top-down model where they're completely exposed to this anti-migrant rhetoric, and they're going to start thinking that way. Similar to how Donald Trump can talk all these, he wants to build a wall and keep all the immigrants out, and people start to believe him. People start to see, wow, that really is the problem when it's actually not. We think politicians, if they're good at anything, they're good at convincing people that they're right, even when they're clearly wrong. So we think there's a real problem that migrants are going to go into these member states, and they're going to feel really unwelcome. They're going to feel isolated. They're not going to develop any kind of identity. Their identity is going to completely shrink. We have these educated Syrians coming in and fleeing, and yes, we agree that they should find a home, they should have a place, but they should not go where they're not welcome. That's what this motion does. It forces member states to take them when they are not welcome. When up to a certain point they are welcomed in Germany, they are welcomed in France, they are welcomed in some member states. There is a place for them. But what kind of sustainability, even if you aren't able to implement this, is only a short-term solution at best. We don't think there's any type of sustainability within this. When you take 100,000 migrants a year, how long are you going to be able to take 100,000 migrants until you no longer have the resource to do that? That time went really fast. Very proud to be here and very proud to go. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his speech. Now call to the floor the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the opening proposition. Hear, hear.
Right now, refugees are quite literally washing up on the shores of Greece in the hopes of continuing their livelihood and in the hopes of staying alive. They're not going to Greece, though. They're showing up to Greece to enter the EU. Now, they understand all these points, that there might be a certain sense of xenophobia in the nations that they end up in. They are going to the EU, not because of their xenophobia there, but because it's a chance for them to survive. They value their lives more than the fact that they might see a little bit of prosecution by the native population. They just want a chance to live. So we don't find an argument that, oh, these people aren't welcome here, so we should just let them die, to be very strong. Now, we see the EU as an organization that holds the core, in its core values, that they want to maintain peace, stability, and prosperity, both internally and in the international community. That means that they, in the founding of the EU, as my partner mentioned, these 28 member states agreed upon the principles that they want to help themselves in their stability and financially, but they also want to hold a higher moral standard, saying that they want the international community to do well with them. Now, we found that on this side, it was argued that the existence of the EU depends on what happens in this quota system, and we completely agree. We find that the EU may completely cease to exist depending on the outcome of this motion, but we find that without a quota system, without a system that offers an immediate plan of action for the EU to deal with crises such as this, but in crises in the future, we see the stability of the EU lacking, and we are fearful for the future of the European Union without this action plan that we're proposing. With what they are doing, you are seeing these arguments among the member states that are leading to a possible disintegration, as they stated, of the EU, and that is caused because we do not have an action plan ready to go when these times of crisis do come about. Now, my partner brought to you the significant reasons, humanitarian reasons of why these people should be accepted by the EU. Why their life is more valuable than a potential financial burden that they will be imposing on the states. But we find that this plan yes.
So how many years do you think this is going to be sustainable for? So one, even if you get the migrants all saved, how long are they going to be able to come in? How long are these countries, member states, going to agree to these quotas?
Let's get something straight. These refugees are going to come to the EU whether or not we have an action plan in place. If we want to put this off and turn them away, that's one thing. But if we want an organized method of dealing with the allocation of these refugees in a financial manner that provides stability, we need a quota system to spread the burden so these member states, so individual member states like Greece and other states that these refugees are flocking to are not overburdened by this. You are seeing member states like Germany who have taken in almost half of the refugees in this situation, closing and shutting down their borders because they can't take any more. And if we have a quota system, we see that Germany will not have to shut down and tighten up its borders because it will have assistance from its member states. Now, it makes financial sense while maintaining the EU's three core principles of peace, stability, and prosperity. It maintains peace among the member states by providing confidence to member nations like Greece, who right now, they're not quite sure where they may stand in the EU. By the EU stepping in, it is saying that they are still united, that they are still looking out for their member states like Greece who are being bombarded by this issue, and that they will make a decision to help This leads to overall peace among the nations because they know where they stand in their agreement. It brings stability among the economy of these member states, where we see that currently it's on shaky grounds. You have a crippling burden being given to certain states, and other states like Hungary are saying, we don't want any of this. Get away from us. Go away, go home. If we share this burden among all the member states, we find that not only will you have stability, economic stability among these nations, but you'll have prosperity among the members, among the citizens who will not have, who will have negligible impacts on their economy because it is a shared burden that they can handle. For these reasons, we're very proud to.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to give the floor to the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue the case for the opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Hear, Okay, I'd like to thank the government so far, as well as my partner on the opposition bench. To begin, I'd like to address a couple of points that the government just made before I go into an expansion of some of the points that my partner made earlier. To begin, the government just actually closed their argument there by talking about how the EU is going to experience unity and we're going to unite against this unite against this problem, or to solve this problem. How the government would like, or excuse me, the opposition would like to ask how an internal argument and disagreement and dissonance is going to create unity in the European Union. We don't see that as the result of this motion whatsoever. Another question that we were sort of forced to ask is regarding spreading the burden. Does government not think that spreading the burden without imposing this quota could be just as effective? Quite frankly, can't we not include 20 states who are willing participants of this quota versus all 28 who are not quite so willing without causing that kind of dissonance? That we on the opposition bench have found to be a little bit problematic. Continuing, we're talking about the burden being spread, and by doing that, it will relieve some of these other states that are facing a larger burden, like Germany and Greece, for example. But again, by imposing this upon other countries, we are just creating more dissonance within the EU.
What happens to the future stability and the following of laws and principles when the EU simply tosses them away because they're financially inconvenient?
Opposition does not necessarily think that it's about throwing them away, it's just about finding a compromise. It's not all or nothing. We're not suggesting that refugees should not be taken care of or attended to. It's just to what degree and to what severity can the EU impose something upon its member states. Moving on to the next point that my partner made and expanding a bit on that, we're talking about the permanent immigrant, or the permanent migrant. At what point are these refugees ever going to feel at home in these nation states? One of the problems that government brought up is this premise that, yes.
So Jewish groups in the UK, British Caribbean groups in the UK, also Southeast Asian groups in the UK, Algerians in France, all Turks in Germany, all these groups have assimilated incredibly well over the period of the last few decades. Why won't Syrians do so in the rest of Europe?
Well, like my partner brought up, there's a lot of rhetoric going around now that's a lot different than the rhetoric regarding those groups. Again, breaking down Christian walls and so forth. We're also talking about preventing these refugees from facing a lack of safety and stability, but moving them to a country that is going to be inherently xenophobic for an indefinite amount of time is only changing the lack of safety they're facing, not saving them from anything, yes.
These people are risking their lives currently on unstable, taped-together boats just for a chance at continuing their life. How is safety in these developed nations even a problem?
As I mentioned, I'm not suggesting that refugees should continue drowning in the Aegean Sea. We're only suggesting that the refugee crisis be addressed in a different way. Again, the xenophobia that these refugees will face in the EU inevitably will go on indefinitely, and again, not prevent them from this lack of safety, but simply shift the focus. Again, when will these migrants ever feel integrated into their country? What kind of opportunities can they find in those countries? We, on the opposition bench, don't see this as being a very promising option. Yes?
How does xenophobia compare against Assad's bombs? And if they're already willing to consent to risk this for the safety of their life, why is this something worth discussing?
Once again, we are not suggesting that refugees should continue facing the plights they're facing. We're just suggesting doing it in a different way. I'm moving on. To discuss the responsibility of the EU and why we don't think it's the EU's independent responsibility to take care of these refugees. Well, and first, as again my partner mentioned briefly, the US, Russia, and Iran, to name a few, could also take a bit of the burden. These are more responsible parties for the crisis and could engage a little bit more in the conversation. In addition, we think that this motion is more harmful to the stability and the unity of the EU than it would be beneficial to the refugee crisis at hand. We're talking about 100,000 refugees per year. We're looking at over 9 million as government opened, with 9 million refugees thus far today having already fled Syria and the surrounding countries. So we're looking at a really small drop in the barrel, given the instability and the lack of unity that it's going to create in the EU. It's for these reasons that the opposition proudly opposes this motion.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce and give the floor for the inaugural speech of the 2015 British Debating Tour of the United States, the member of
Ladies and gentlemen, no one puts their child on a boat unless they think that the water is safer than the land that they currently live on. When you see children washed up dead on the shore, it's not because their parents didn't care about them, it's because they cared about them enough to move them from the hell that is Aleppo currently, from the bombing, from the terror of the Assad regime. These are the people that we stand for to help today. An opening proposition tell you why they need rescuing from Syria. They tell you why their lives are so awful. We're going to tell you from closing proposition why quotas are the only option to ensure that these people get a life that they deserve, a life that any human being deserves. We're going to create a clear comparison between what will happen if we don't impose quotas across the EU. That is bottlenecking in places that are unsustainable for those migrants. That is an instruction of the EU that opening opposition want to talk to you about. And it is ultimately a worse life for everybody involved in this debate. Very quickly, some rebuttal before I move into substantive. Firstly, the idea that it's not just the EU's obligation. That's possibly true, but just because the US and Iran won't do anything doesn't mean that we shouldn't. Secondly, permanent migration. Matt points out in the point of information it does work. When Jewish people fled Germany because of the persecution of the Nazis, they arrived in the UK and they found shelter there, right? These people are also fleeing that kind of persecution, that kind of terror. We do believe that there are enough good people in the UK, even if our government aren't any of them, that they will welcome these people back. Secondly, they're already here and actually the places that they end up in and the places that they will end up in without quotas are far worse for them. More of that later. Thirdly, a lot of these people want to go back to Syria eventually. They just need stability. My final point of substantive is going to look at the long-term foreign policy implications of this policy. Thirdly, on the idea that Britain is going to leave or that we're going to just say no. Firstly, we really hope that we won't, okay? Partly because accepting allows us to renegotiate the terms that we work with the EU on, which is something that the Tory government are incredibly supportive of. But also, there just realistically isn't actually the support in Britain to leave the EU once you start mobilising people. That's not the way that that election is going to go. The bottleneck comparative and what happens when we don't institute this policy. People keep fleeing Syria. Opening government tell you exactly why. In their world, these people land on the shores of Greece, or they walk up to the wire fences in Hungary, Croatia, and Romania. And what do they see there? What do they meet there? They have no shelter, they have no food, and they have no friendship. Because those are just the kinds of places where the problems that opening opposition talk to you about, the problems of xenophobia, the problems of fear of migrants are particularly bad. And not only they're particularly bad, but these people are facing just an enormous number more migrants than they would if we instituted quotas. Because none of the migrants are in the UK, and none of the migrants are in Spain, and none of the migrants are in France. Instead, they are all in these places that don't have the kind of infrastructure that can provide for them, that don't have the kind of political ideologies that mean people will. Winter is coming, and a Game of Thrones reference. When people fled the Soviet Union, the Yugoslav wars, and Kosovo, they literally died because of the cold. That is what you are asking Syrian refugees, who have already made the most dangerous crossing possible, to face when you say that you will not mandate France to take them, you will not mandate Italy to take them. They also face violence. See opening opposition's analysis on the stuff that happens in Hungary. What else happens? We actually get breakdown in the EU because these weak spots, these places that cannot cope, are being told that this isn't a shared responsibility. This isn't something that wealthy Western Europe has to deal with because we're not going to make them take quotas, right? There aren't 20 willing states that will take them. Maybe Germany will. Eventually Germany will run out of patience. I'll take you in a second. In fact, now, go.
There are only a handful of states who oppose the quota. If quotas are the only way of getting this done, that means that handful of states are necessary for getting this done as well.
So that's not true in that we've, Britain has decided that they're opting out of this stuff, but also the quotas that are being set are not high enough. The countries that can take a burden are not taking that burden. France is not taking enough immigrants. Spain is not taking enough immigrants. The UK is not taking anywhere near enough immigrants, right? So they're flooding to Germany. Eventually political will run out. Opening government tell you that. That means that we get German resentment of France, Spain, the UK, and all of those people who are shirking. We get Romanian resentment and Hungarian resentment of all of those places. We need EU stability because we need security, we need economic cooperation, we need political influence, we need international influence on this issue. What else do we get when Syrian refugees arrive in the UK? We cut the apathy that exists in the UK and other places in Western Europe for foreign policy. They see the human cost. It's not £1 million from their annual budget that they honestly would not even notice missing because they have no idea how big that is. Instead, it's meeting someone in your kid's primary school. It's meeting somebody in your local supermarket who has fled from Aleppo, who knows the horrors that UK apathy has caused in these places. It means MPs have to start talking about these things. We get long-term foreign policy change as well as a relief to the immediate situation. So proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and now I'd like to turn the floor over to the member of the opposition to open up the case for closing up with a 5-minute speech. Here, here.
Liberty, safety, human rights. We on side opposition agree with government that this is important. We agree that these refugees are entitled to these rights. We agree that this is something that needs to center discussion around. But where we inherently disagree is with the idea that by somehow imposing these minimum quotas, we're going to better be able to uphold these human rights. By somehow imposing these minimum quotas, we're better going to be able to protect these refugees. And by somehow imposing these minimum quotas, we're going to be able to uphold the principles of the EU. This is what we want to talk to you about today. But before we get into that, we have a few issues with the last speech we heard. We hear a lot about this idea of minimum quotas and why we think that by imposing these quotas, now everybody is going to take all of the refugees and we're going to live in a great and happy world. We don't think this is what happens. Instead, we tell you that what happens is imposing minimum quotas allows for nations to cop out. So now Germany can say, we took this many people, so we don't have to take any more. We think these nations can say, we did our share, now we don't have to take any more. We don't have to allow for more refugees to come in. We think we don't get this big humanitarian push that allows refugees to find a safe haven. Instead, we think what we do is we politicize what it means to be humanitarian or good Samaritan. We think that what we do is we allow these nations to say, I'm done, I'm not taking any more. We think what we do is essentially not help the Syrians in the way we need help. We're telling you that yes, these refugees need help. Yes, this is a crisis. But no, imposing quotas is not the way to go about this. Yes.
There are countries that will simply not take these people. And in your world, are we simply going to appease every racist state and let them forgo the principles they swore to uphold?
So we think that this is more than appeasing racist states. And we're going to talk to you about these principles that they did swear to uphold in our speech. So let's get on to that. We think that what the principles they swore to uphold are more than this idea of liberty and safety. We think essentially what the EU is a conglomerate of states that came together to make free market economics easier. We think they're not arbiters of moral humanitarian rights, but if you want them to be, we can talk about them in that way. So what does this mean? We think that the EU is founded on this idea of consensus building. So what this means is that when these states bought into the EU and bought into this conglomerate, they bought into it under the impression that their voice would have a say, that when they said, no, I don't want this to happen, it's not going to happen. We think that this is eroded. These principles that allow for us to facilitate stability and for us to facilitate human rights and freedom and liberty and all of these great things that government talks to you about. The only way we can do that is with a stable European Union. So how do we destabilize the European Union? We want to talk about this a little bit more. We think we destabilize it when we say that, no, Hungary, your voice actually doesn't mean anything because I'm Germany, so I get to tell you what to do. We think, no, Hungary, you're too little and you don't have enough money, but I have money and money's what's important, so you don't get to have voice. You don't get to talk. What does this do within the European Union? We think that that necessarily what this does is it erodes these principles. The idea that it is a consensus builder, that you do have a voice, that you do have a say. No, not now. We think that what this does is it erodes the trust that functions between the nations. So even in the best case scenario, even in the best possible situation where these refugees are taken in to these states, we think the EU is beginning to collapse. We think it's beginning to erode. And we think this is a very probable situation. Because now we have countries like Hungary or Austria who are upset that their voices weren't heard. We have a precedent set that's saying Germany and the countries who have more money get to bully and dictate what happens to the countries who don't. And we hear that on this side. We hear that they talk to us about this idea that we don't think bullying should happen. We don't think that Germany should get to say, I took in more refugees so I can bully you. But we think that's what's happening now. We think that by imposing these quotas, we're telling these smaller countries you don't have a voice, we're telling them they don't have a place in the EU, and we're telling them that the EU is not as stable as it looks. So what does this mean? We think that this precedent for bullying goes far beyond this crisis, because we recognize that the decisions we're making in this crisis happen on a basis because there's something tragic happening. We think that we need to step back, and we think we need to allow these countries to make their own decisions. We heard some great arguments about sovereignty, and we think that this is important. We think that individual decision-making on behalf of these states who bought into the system are important. We think that when you impose this on a nation and you tell them you have to do this, they're never going to do it to the extent that you want them to, even if they did. When your mom tells you to wash the dishes, you're not going to wash them as good as you would if you went and decided, hey, I'm going to wash the dishes. We think that we should not tell these countries what it is they can and can't do. We think if we do, they're not going to do it to the extent that we want them to do it. We think that if we do, in the long term, we're going to see cracks in the EU. We think we're going to see destabilization throughout the European Union. We think that they won't be able to hold up these great ideals that we think are also so important. And we also think a lot of bad things are going to happen to these refugees within these states, but my partner will talk to you more about that. For all these reasons, we're very
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to call before the final speaker from the government bench. The government whip will close the debate. The government side of the House, here.
Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a time where thousands are dying, Syria is burning, and the EU seems to possibly be on the rocks. It's not a good autumn for humanity, hope, nor the helpless. What we show in this debate is an opportunity to solve those three issues. Through the power of our common endeavour, we want to show that humanity lives on in Europe. We want to show through the power of our common endeavour that through spreading the burden, through releasing the pressure of those most fragile parts of the EU, we can maintain the EU project. Because they're wrong when they say the EU is not about human rights. The EU is absolutely about human rights. It's absolutely about peace. That is why it mandates Council of Europe membership and therefore European Court of Human Rights membership for all of its members. That is why it doesn't let Turkey in because it continues to torture its citizens. That is why it doesn't let Belarus in because it continues to be a dictatorship. The EU is as much a moral project as it is a financial one. The greatest successes of the EU are to move Greece out of dictatorship, to move Spain out of dictatorship, to move Portugal out of dictatorship, to push Croatia towards the path of sustainable parliamentary democracy. The EU is absolutely a moral project. They are wrong there. Notice also that opposition keep talking about, oh, but there's going to be some other way. It's fine, just not this one, not quotas. What other way are they talking about? They don't give us any mechanism for how they are going to solve this. And they cannot sit there and expect to accept winning this debate with the thousands of potentially dead refugees on their side of the house. As Chessie points out, winter is coming. The problem is for them, right? They use this analogy of washing the dishes. But no one is going to wash the dishes unless we make them do it right now. We are perfectly willing to make them do it because that is the only way we can save lives. Right then, no, thank you. I'm going to talk about two things today. I'm going to talk about, first of all, refugees, and secondly, EU disintegration. But before that, let's talk very quickly about the idea of how the EU disintegrates. We will get from the last speech. Because the EU is just not about simply only having your own way. Note it is a democratic institution through the Council of Ministers. You are always going to lose some votes. Minorities lose votes. That is what happened with the UK when we voted against the new EU Parliament President in Juncker. However, what is worse for Hungary, right? Either Hungary has to take a small quota of refugees under the quota policy, and they lose this vote. Or all of Europe rejects refugees, and Hungary remains, as Chessie points out, the eternal bottleneck for refugees. If Hungary is racist, and Hungary hates refugees, no thank you, then you can be sure that they are going to really hate being the eternal bottleneck of Europe. Always having those thousands of people trying to get through those gates, trying to get through that barbed wire fence, and fighting with their police as they have been doing over the last few days. Yes, please, go ahead.
If the EU is a moral project, like you say, how are you going to tell these people that there are no willing states that are going to take refugees if they're not forced to?
Look, it is unfortunate that there are unwilling states in the European Union, but I would say that as a refugee, I would prefer to be welcomed by Spain knowing that the EU mandated that, rather than being left to the other side of a razor wire fence in Hungary. At least the EU is welcoming me at that point. At least the EU is being moral at that point. And this is important, right? Because if the EU is to be a moral actor in the world, how can we complain to Australia when they fail to uphold the UN Convention of 1951 on refugees if we are not doing the same thing ourselves? We don't just have to be moral within ourselves, but also outside in the world as well. We should be a moral leader there. First of all then, refugees, because they are facing a terrible plight. As Chessie points out, you only put your kids in inflatable boats over winter seas at the point at which it is too dangerous for them to survive on land. This is important for two reasons. First of all, because, as Open Government point out, we have a moral obligation to these people. Open opposition say, oh, well, maybe other places have moral obligations too. Yes, very true. I would love to ensure that the US took more refugees. I would love to ensure that Canada took more refugees, but that is not what this debate is about. We can ensure that the EU takes more, and that's where our moral obligation lies. But more importantly, Chessie tells you, because it is so dangerous in Syria, people will keep coming. That bottleneck is so dangerous, and this is the only way we can solve that. Finally then, EU disintegration. Because where is the EU weak? It is not really weak in the UK. It is weak in places like Hungary, where, as they point out, we have racist leaders. It is weak in Greece. It is weak in Spain. When people are weak in Croatia, when their citizens need our safety, that prosperity, those human rights that the EU can promise, we need to make sure those states stay within the EU. We can only do that if we spread the bottleneck, if we spread the pressure. Because currently the pressure is falling upon Greece, it is falling upon Croatia, it is falling upon Hungary. Or furthermore, scarily, it is falling upon Germany. Germany has been the key link in the European Union for so long. At the point at which they start to lose faith in the European project, at the point at which they fail to leave the European project, that is when we lose Hungary, that is when we lose Croatia, and that is when we lose Greece. We fail the citizens of Greece when the EU fails like that. We do not want to fail neither refugees, nor do we want to fail the EU. The only answer in this debate is side proposition. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech. Now I'll turn the floor over to our final speaker in the debate, the final speaker for the opposition side, the opposition whip, to give a speech not to exceed 5 minutes. You're here.
Here.
Sorry. So before I get into like the bulk of what my speech will be about, I should fix this. We are not going to send these refugees back to Syria. We're not going to just let them die on the shore. I want to make that very clear. This is not what the opposition supports, and this is not what we are going to let happen. We feel that this should be done a separate way. This quota system is not going to ensure the true safety of these refugees. So let's move into like what we... So just ignore the sign. So let me just get into the material of my speech. So we'd like to talk about the political climate in the EU as it stands. So what we see happening is that there's a rise of right-wing parties, which will implement xenophobic rhetoric. So let me explain what xenophobia is, because it hasn't been explained before. What it is systematic oppression, which is usually violent towards people based off their race, gender, or country of origin, or like particular like hailing from a specific social group. So what we see is that when people are not right now. So when we see when these right-wing groups are using this type of rhetoric towards the people of their nation, what we find is that they're going to point out these refugees as the problem. And we feel this is extremely bad, because when they're pointed out as the problem, then these right-wing parties can use these refugees to gain leverage. Thank you. So we feel that once they gain support from the people of their nation from this right-wing rhetoric, we feel that they'll gain support and then they'll implement policies which will lower the quality of life of the refugees once they're actually there. So now let me transition into something, transition into what actually is a refugee. So a refugee, yes.
So you keep saying you have this other policy for saving refugees. What is your policy to ensure that dead Syrian children don't wash up on our beaches?
What we feel is that forcing states that don't want these refugees, actually I'll get into that because that actually clashes with some of my speech. So what we feel is that what a refugee actually is a person who is seeking asylum, who is fleeing their nation because of extreme horror or things happening in their nation that is causing them to not feel safe there. So what we see is that this happens from unforeseen circumstances, usually violent or life-threatening. But what we find is that when they go to these new states, the same thing is going to happen. What we feel is that once they're there, they're not given the proper place to live. They're not given this whole utopia, what they want to paint it as. What we see is that they're staying in these things called refugiados, which are basically slums. We see that they're not given adequate food. We see that there's extreme sickness moving throughout these refugiados. We see that they're mismanaging funds that are supposed to go to actually helping these refugees. So it's not this utopia that they're trying to paint. This isn't the world, no thank you, this isn't the world which they want you to believe it is. And what eventually happens is actually there's death and famine spreading throughout these refugiados. So, and also, what we feel is that there's also the idea of mobility. They're not actually able to leave these states. They're not members of the EU. They're not actually able to move freely around to each state in the way that regular EU citizens would be allowed to. So one, they're in these terrible, terrible situations where they're getting extremely sick, they're dying, and also they're not allowed to leave. Now, let's talk about what happens to these refugees later on in life. So what we see is that there's two options for what will happen to these refugees. They're either forced to wait out the storm until whatever happens in their country boils over. What we see when this happens is they're in this hostile country that doesn't want them. They're having these xenophobic policies placed over them. They're being systematically oppressed. No, thank you. And we feel that when this happens, this has implications that is generational. No, thank you. So what we see is that these people are suffering in this nation. They fled their nation to come to a nation that is also oppressing them. And then the only other option is to either assimilate. And what we feel is this is extremely dangerous. Because in order to assimilate, you have to trade identities. You are no longer yourself. What you do is you give up parts of your culture, which is essentially part of who you are, what helped develop you to be you. And when you lose part of your identity, you lose who you are, and we feel that is extremely damaging to actually being to the refugees. So then you're not actually you that fled Syria or whatever nation that you're a refugee of is not the you that is living in these nations. This is a different person. This is a person who is still suffering because of the right wing xenophobic policies. And we feel what also happens is that the EU will also collapse because these nations that didn't want you are now forced to have you. They're not getting their word in what actually happens in the EU and in policy implementation. So what happens is these member states don't feel like they actually belong to be part of the EU, and also they're going to oppress the refugees as a whole because of this thing.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thanks to all the debaters. I now invite both sides to cross the aisle, shake hands, and let's congratulate them on an excellent. Alright, I thought that was quite good, and we've listened to them speak for about 45 minutes. Now it's your turn to speak at them. So if you have questions or comments about the debate, things you thought were good, things that you wonder why they didn't bring it up, or actually any questions you have sort of in general about St. John's debate. I know there's some young people here, and admissions would be very upset if they didn't hear me say www.stjohns.edu, which they will, because I'm videotaping this. And anything at all about the British tour, the Committee for International Discussion and Debate from the National Communication Association, ASU, a partner on this forever. And it's a great tour, and maybe anything about what college, and I'm kind of open, I'm kind of like putting on the spot here, but anything about university in the UK or anything about UK life or anything would be great as well, or comments on the debate. So I'll recognize my colleague, Dr. Wright.
How do you come up with arguments that don't sound murderous? Especially in a debate like this, like specifically the opposition. How did you come up with arguments? I mean, because that's hard to argue against this, right? Like it's hard to argue against the government's ideas. What did you do? How did you think of it?
Okay, so I guess I'll start. So we do think it's hard because, of course, on opposition, we don't want to get up here and be like, no, we're sending everybody from Syria back. Like, that's awful. Like, we think that it's a true crisis. But we think that rather than attacking the idea of, like, Syrian and the refugees, we talk about, like, the methods or the implementation of how we're going to integrate these refugees. So I don't know if anybody noticed, but, like, we were trying to make it clear on the side that we don't want to send these refugees back. What instead we want the debate to be about is what it means to impose a law on somebody who doesn't want it, or what it means to force a state to do something they don't want to do. So instead of having to attack or like face head on this idea of like why we think refugees shouldn't come to safe zones, we attack the way that like policies are made to integrate them into these safe zones.
Anybody else want to take that on? How to make non-evil sounding arguments in difficult positions?
The funny thing about debate is I could potentially disagree with everything that I said, but in that moment I strongly believe that this was the best way, or theirs was the worst way to uphold human rights. So, but in that moment you really believe what you're saying. So I think that's how you get around that. But you know, I haven't made the decision if I agree with that or not. But I guess tomorrow after the debate hangover is done, I'll be able to make that decision.
This sounds like the Stanislavski School of Debate. Just embody the characters and call it. Yeah, go ahead.
I just think there's like almost always more than one way to tell a story, and that's effectively what we do when we stand up, is we just tell you a story and hopefully you guys believe us. And the reality is that there are probably some people who have fled Syria who will be treated so badly in the places that they go that it might not have been the best option for them. And you've got to paint the section of the picture that works best for your side of the house. Because that is always, we wouldn't be having a debate if that wasn't a diverse picture. And the point is you want to make the colours and sort of features of that section of the painting so vivid that everyone looks at that, and everything else looks a bit grey and a bit unclear in comparison. I guess is like the best way to do that.
Yeah, I think especially too if you're not, if you expand it beyond just the refugees, and they talk about like what could potentially happen with all these people leaving the EU as member states, and how that might economically fall apart, or how this might actually jeopardize life for not just the refugees, but the citizens already living within those borders, then now not only is this bad for the refugees, but bad for all people within those countries. And that sounds like a much greater harm, potentially, of people who were actually safe and now no longer are because of the quotas that they're imposing. And so I think from their side, if they can convincingly tell you that, look, it's going to be terrible to be a refugee in either world, but in our world it's also terrible to now be a citizen who was safe and no longer because the EU is falling apart, then I think that's also like something they can paint and sell where it's just an even greater harm than anything else that we could spin. So I think it's just kind of twisting scenarios and making, I don't know, comparing just terrible, terrible things on either side.
Okay, great. Anyone else? This gentleman here.
Did you find this debate required you to engage in more speculation than normal, since there's so many moving parts and it's just difficult to draw in facts and history? There were some references to crises in World War II and more recent crises, but it seems like it's hard to grapple with so many big ticket items at once, and you have to look into a crystal ball, just as compared to the other debates you've done.
Yeah.
So it is both difficult and more easy in that we have more things that we can say plausibly to try and convince you as an audience that we're correct. Because debating isn't just about actually finding, it's kind of cynical, but debating isn't about finding the truth or about presenting an argument which you would want to see written in the newspaper or want to direct political discourse, but rather trying out of the available facts that you have to try and present a convincing case. So in some ways, because there is so much uncertainty about, for example, what happens with the EU, if I knew what was going to happen with the EU, I'd be placing huge bets on that right now and trying to make way more money than I had ever dreamed of. Unfortunately, I have no idea what on earth is going to happen with the EU. But luckily, that sort of penumbra, that grey area that no one knows about, but also allows us as debaters to try and occupy that space. It makes it much easier for us within the debate because there's so much because there is so much which is unknown. We are able to start making claims about that unknown space. In some debates, that unknown space is very small. Everyone knows about 95% of the matter in the debate, and you're arguing for 5%. In a debate like this, people only know about 5% of the debate, which is that there's a huge problem, and no one knows how to solve it. So in some ways, it gives you a lot more freedom. And I think that's quite liberating in some ways.
And I think you try to push it into something that's reasonable too. So there's a whole lot of things that could happen. But for example, World War III probably won't emerge. I was in a room a few weeks back where they tried to argue that, and it just didn't seem quite potentially plausible. But some of these things are just realistic scenarios that you can play out, like what happens when these far-right states who are very close to gaining control use these refugees as propaganda in order to get that majority rule that they need, and then have the voting power to remove themselves from the EU. That's very plausible. What's also plausible on our side is just the idea that you cannot overcrowd certain states. You can't leave it all in Germany. And so there are plausible things, and it's just kind of weeding out the kind of ludicrous and putting to something that sounds believable, that if somebody told you, you can say, yeah, I see that happening. If they look at you like you're crazy, then it's probably not the route you want to go. But you do try to not just explore any part of the gray area, but something that seems convincing and something that seems like it could potentially happen. If, I don't know, you could be like, yeah, I'd buy that, instead of, I don't know, some maybe post-apocalyptic world, which who knows could happen, but I think what we heard today was probably more plausible than that, so, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. One is, if you're in the opposition side, especially in a debate like this, it's like this implied burden that you have to present an alternative vision, when that's not really your charge, right? You're saying there are other solutions, but that's not what's on the table here. What's on the table is, the merits of the quota system, but there really is an implied burden that you have to, just because you're saying no to this, and you're saying that all of the children from Syria should die. And the government sort of takes advantage of that, right? So how do you, is that sort of the nature of being the opposition side? And how do you kind of manage that? Because you're inevitably kind of the bad guys, because they can always say
Yeah, I think sometimes that's actually the government side where they have the burden of trying to overcome a really damaging thing like not upholding human rights. But not every debate has to have a counter model. Sometimes the burden isn't to make a counter model. It's often fun to make a counter model and say, well, this is how we want to do it, but sometimes it's not very advantageous to do that. So I don't think in this one we had to come up with a counter model, but we definitely could have.
I don't know if I agree or disagree, because I partially did, we were talking, and we were saying, how awful do we sound? We're they're saying, all these people are going to die, and we're well, we could try something else. It sounds really bad, so, I sometimes do think there might be some sort of, an inherent or, implied burden, but I think what you try to do is, you make their world seem so bad that, the impacts of doing it kind of outweigh, or you say that, something we were kind of talking about is the idea of, maybe we just don't force people to do it, and we let everyone who wants to can go ahead and take as many refugees as they want, and the 4 states who are we really don't want to, don't have to. So you kind of try to get around it, but sometimes it is hard because you don't want to get up there and be this is what we think should happen, X, Y, and Z, because it's not really our burden, but sometimes you feel you might have to compete with something that sounds as horrific as letting children continue to die.
Yeah, go ahead. The topic that you were discussing tonight is something that is occurring in real time as we speak. How did you, as teams and individuals, source your information? I was interested that in all the speeches I heard tonight, I don't think one speech actually quoted any statistics or referred to any hard data. We all know, of course, that the press and the media in this day and age are perhaps not as objective as maybe they used to be decades ago. How did you source your information?
Well, actually, finding those biased views are actually really great when it comes to making your debate. You want to hear someone's view that's completely for their side with no middle ground, because then you can say, you can hold up a mirror to them and be like, well, is that true? Why is that true? And if they're with your side, you can agree with it and come up with ways to get rid of the burdens that they're taking on. Or if they're against you, you can say, well, I just don't buy that, and come up with X, Y, and Z for why. One thing about British Parliament debate is usually you hear a motion 15 minutes before you're going to speak. And you're not allowed to use technology to look up sources. And one of the greatest things that I think Steve has us do in practice is we've found that it's unconvincing to state 10 facts and say, this is why you were right. If you come up there and say, 2.1 million people are dying, therefore we need a solution, that may be true, but why is that solution the best solution? Will those 2.1 million people actually be helped? And the fact that it's 2.1 million people or 1,000 people that are going to die doesn't make a difference. You want to get at the humanitarian arguments of the stability arguments of the government rather than listing off statistics most often.
Yeah, so in terms of prep, Matt and I woke up this morning and went on the BBC News website to double check that the EU hadn't made a decision that would break the debate. And then we were on a train back from a school up in Terrytown this afternoon. We sat down with our brains and pens and paper and thought about what we thought the arguments that might come up were. We said, you could take the debaters out of Britain, but you can't necessarily take Britain out of the debaters. And I think that British parliamentary very much focuses on your ability to create arguments and persuasive reasoning that don't rely on facts. Because for every survey that tells you that there is a 25% increase in your likelihood of getting cancer if you smoke, there's going to be one that tells you that's rubbish. And as debaters, we're not necessarily in there to adjudicate those kind of statistics, but it's about making it believable for an audience and tying it to things that they do understand, that they do know. And that's a form of debate that we love and we really appreciate that. Or there are other forms of debate that are very much more about evidence and facts and research, and they teach you different skills that are also important. But this is, we prefer it.
You'll encounter some of those forms of the tour. They're coming. One last question, then we'll have to wrap up.
Similarly, in that vein, I'm wondering if you don't. One of the most persuasive things that we see in debates when we go to our kids' debates is passion. Yeah. So if you're taking a position that you don't believe, for all the young people here, how do you manufacture passion?
That's excellent. You want to start, Caitlin?
Sure. So typically you can find something you agree with. So you might not agree with how this should be done, but you should agree life should be saved. So you can look and say what within these principles that the EU is founded upon, why should they be acting a certain way? And you can normally stand behind those principles, so you might not agree 100%, I had to do a feminist motion trying to say that, the government shouldn't be, giving, tax breaks to, work on the pay gap. But, you can, take a few steps back and say, okay, well, what should equality look like? And you can typically believe that. What should the protection of life look like? So I think all of us agree these lives should be protected. And you get passion from that. And then what you have to do is convincingly say, how do we do this? So there should never be, you should never be faking 100% of your speech. Right. There should be some core principle that you believe in. So if you believe these refugees deserve safety, which all of us agreed on, what we disagreed was how to do that. You should be drawing passion from these people need to be saved. Whether or not we disagree on how that happens, that's fine, but you should be drawing passion on some core principle on how you view these people or something like that. So never fake 100% of your argument.
I would completely agree that the core principle stuff is very important. There are a couple of other, perhaps more cynical tricks that I use. Perhaps the first one is that the rhetorical tricks I try and use on an audience are ones that obviously I write down and try and psych myself up with myself. So people who, these guys at the front who have already had sort of style sessions that I've given them, will know when I talk about alliteration and when I talk about rules of three. These are really important ways that just for some unknown reason, if lists alliterate, and if they are done in batches of three, they are just way more convincing. So, for example, I wrote down on a piece of paper and then underlined, humanity, hope, and the helpless. Like, it just is more. That just kind of psychs me up a little bit. It just kind of gets me. It's like people who play rock music to their horses before they like race. It's a needless little trick that you can use to psych yourself up, but sometimes just does help. The second one is perhaps just being competitive. Helps to some degree. That if you want to win a debate, you are just quite likely to sort of push that passion, because you know that is one of the ways that you can kind of win. In a similar way to an actor doesn't necessarily have to empathise with King Lear, but like really enjoys the acting and wants to do that to the very greatest degree, they will then infer a degree of passion and empathy with that character, even if that's not a genuine empathy. I think that's the same thing is also true to some degree of debaters. We want to debate at the very highest level that we possibly can. So we'll look for that passion and we'll generate that passion just through that sort of natural competitiveness and sort of devotion to the art of attempting to be persuasive.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys for taking.
Can I just say a couple things?
Now I'm going to turn it over to Carol here.
I just said a couple things before we wrap up. Oops, we said we'd be done now. I just need to do a quick advertisement for the ESU. We worked with the debaters to pick this topic for a reason, a couple reasons. One is it was very much in current events in the news, and that is something that we do with our middle school debaters all the time. In fact, I can imagine a topic or one very closely to this showing up in our November tournaments. And so we will be seeing 10 to 14-year-olds staging debates, not unlike what we saw, slightly different format. The other reason we selected this topic is because it is near and dear to our hearts and some other programs that we do here at the ESU. For those of you who've never experienced the ESU or come in contact, we run a series of programs in this building that serve new immigrants to the country and serve refugees and help them to integrate into New York City culture, help them to gain the skills to find a job and to help them to improve their English. So the issue of refugees is something that we talk about daily in this building, so it's important to us to stage this debate as well. Finally, a huge thank you to all of you for demonstrating these wonderful skills for all of us today. To Matt and Chessie, who are starting their journey across the country, 17 states, I believe you told me you'll be visiting. We're delighted to start them in New York City, and they will be blogging. Can you tell us, is there a quick reference to your blog, or we'll post it on our website?
So it's from the land of the tea, as in TEA, the thing we drink a lot of, to the home of the brave, and then I think it's .wordpress.com or something. But if you just search the first bit, you should find us. There's a bunch of photos, so it's reasonably recognizable. We've got 2 posts on there at the moment, but we're going to be hoping to do them maybe once a week, twice a week, something like that.
You'll blog about tonight?
We will blog about tonight, yeah.
And we'll post that on our website as well, so anybody here can follow them on their journey from here to Las Vegas.
Oh, wow.
And back and forth.
And back and, yeah, we kind of do this all the way across the country from this place.
So thank you to all. Does anybody else want to add anything? There's some more.
I got an appropriate remark. Inappropriate, really inappropriate. Game of Thrones, winter is coming, right? So do you remember when it was first mentioned, who said it, and under what circumstances?
I mean, so in a classic debater style, I've never actually seen any Game of Thrones.
It's an appropriate remark, but this is the first time Ned Stark mentions this while he's standing with his sword, eyes, and blood, after he decapitated a person who's an oath breaker. He escaped the wall from whom? From White Walkers. So this person was a refugee, actually.
Well, interesting that you mentioned Ned Stark, because our blog, as you might notice from the Land of the Tea, is entirely Yorkshire themed. So throughout Yorkshire is an area in England that we are both very fond of. Chessie is from there, and I went to university in Yorkshire. So in most of our photos we are wearing flat caps, which is a sort of hat that you see a lot of in Yorkshire. And Ned Stark, Sean Bean, is from Yorkshire, and he received an honorary degree from my university.
And did you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for coming down, and to the ESU for sort of having us, and also the Mountbatten Institute for sort of putting us up in a very nice apartment, which we've really enjoyed. We love sort of New York, New Jersey. It's been great to be here.
Wonderful.
chat, so enjoy yourselves. And come back again.